on the subject of the biological clock, James, obviously this is very relevant to various different cognitive functions. And my impression is that a lot of the research on this subject is focused specifically on measures of attention. And if you look at daily fluctuations in measures such as attention, there are certain patterns that seem to be relatively consistent between people. The most conspicuous of these is that there's a lunchtime nadir in certain aspects of cognition, which probably has some evolutionary roots. So if you think about our distant ancestors who are living in relatively hot environments during the middle of the day, they probably would have wanted to stay out of the sun's potentially damaging rays. And then interestingly, that might be relevant to siesta cultures. In some hotter climates, people often have a nap at that time of day. So I think that that is biologically programmed, which shouldn't come as any surprise to anyone. But there might also be some interaction between time of day fluctuations in cognition and chronotype, whether someone's more of an early bird or a night owl. Alongside this, though, we also tend to have more control over what we're doing at the start of the day before we start getting pulled in lots of different directions. And there are also some other factors that can influence some of these daily rhythms in cognition. And so one of these is a background of insufficient sleep, for example. And if you look at the research on how insufficient sleep affects exercise performance, then interestingly, the effects of homeostatic sleep drive, the effects of this insufficient sleep and the subsequent increase in daytime sleepiness that it leads to, seem to more or less override time of day or circadian clock driven changes in physical performance. And so, based on this, I'd be tempted to assume that if somebody regularly isn't getting enough sleep, then front loading their most important cognitive work might be relatively more important. And that could also be true of evening types who might otherwise feel best and most cognitively sharp in the evening. So I realize that's a long preamble to my question, but what do you think about using knowledge of circadian biology to inform work schedules? And do you think that recent sleep history should be factored in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting perspective on it in terms of factoring in recent sleep history. There's a risk with this that, again, we can kind of try to be too precise, I think. I do think that circadian type, chronotype can be informative in terms of thinking about work schedules, but not necessarily to try and get people to focus in on a really granular level about exactly when their peak alertness is, but rather helping people to recognize that there are natural fluctuations in alertness which will make some parts of the day generally better suited to certain types of work, but also perhaps equally importantly to recognize that some parts of the day are better suited to rest and recovery or less intense work, and that you should try to actually structure your day in service of that. And the reason I think this is helpful is because of these prevalent always-on working patterns, which we kind of briefly mentioned earlier, and this boundaryless work. Because there's a risk, I think, for many knowledge workers that they end up working in this state of continuous partial attention. They just skip from one meeting to another, try and get a bit of work done in between, do some emails later in the day, and they're always on. And actually introducing this idea that there is a biological basis for these natural rhythms in alertness that potentially support or maybe aren't so helpful for cognitive performance. For some people, it gives them a sense of permission that it's okay not to try and be productive all the time. And that's actually a bit of a breakthrough for some people who have this expectation that they should just be able to churn out the work all day long and into the evening. And if they're not, that somehow they're defective in some way or not a true high performer. And actually recognizing that it's okay to have these rhythms of peak, valley, as I might call it, the nadir, and then the rebound where your alertness starts to rise again. And that perhaps you were teaming me up to talk about this kind of heuristic framework that you've heard me talk about before, of cognitive gears, where really that's a way of helping people to think about how different types of work might be better suited to different phases during the day, but also to just pay a bit more attention to those natural rhythms and alertness, because I think that people rarely do. Talking about recent sleep history and how that plays into it, I think that is key as well, because again, I think that there's this risk that we've approached knowledge work in a very industrial way. And by that, I mean we've tried to adopt these industrial paradigms of work that are based on fixed hours and consistent rates of production, which is possible if you're standing in front of a production line that is moving past you at a given rate while you screw on bottle caps. Whereas knowledge work is much more subjective in many ways. There will be these phases of high productivity, low productivity, going back to that idea of creativity as well. Actually, you might be more productive, in inverted commas, by in the nadir of your day taking a nap or going for a walk and then coming back and jotting down those ideas that emerged during the rebound period of your day. And then maybe structuring that thinking so that on the subsequent day, you spend a couple of hours in that peak period formalizing those creative thoughts that emerged into some work product that is going to be helpful for you and your colleagues. In terms of recent sleep history, it's an interesting one because a lot of the time the conversations I have in practice are just very fundamental and really just thinking about the fact that if you haven't been sleeping adequately, that's going to have a profound impact on your cognitive performance regardless of your chronotype. And so, often the way that thinking is operationalized is helping people to recognize that, again, there's not really that much point trying to get into the micro of optimizing your work patterns for peak valleys and rebound with this cognitive gears model if you're not getting adequate sleep, because you're just going to be perpetually fatigued. And it might mask any of the kind of optimization you might try and do around scheduling. So I do think there's a place for thinking about chronotype and circadian phase and patterns in alertness, trying to schedule different types of work in a way that's consistent with those natural patterns rather than just try and force your way through. But it's got to be on this foundation of adequate sleep. Otherwise, I think that can just overwhelm any of the possible benefits from scheduling according to whether you're a morning type, evening type, or somewhere in between. And I guess my final point as well, and again, would be interested to hear your view on this, is it does seem that most people are kind of somewhere in the middle in terms of chronotype rather than more extreme morning or evening. And so again, I think we can overemphasize, I think, the importance of it sometimes in the context of knowledge work. I think it's a relevant factor, but actually, the level of shift that's required is perhaps not as extreme for most people as we might think. For me, it's more about just recognizing those general patterns and changes in alertness which we all have, and trying to work in a way that's more consistent with that rather than fighting against it.
On the subject of science communication, one thing I try and do, which is really hard to get right, and I'm sure that I get this wrong frequently, is wear different hats such that I can speak to people who have quite deep knowledge of a subject, but also you can frame things in ways that people can understand. And my benchmark for that is my mother. And I think I'm often better at the former than the latter. So I apologize if some of this seems esoteric at times, but you raise many interesting points there. One of the subjects that I'm curious about is how these different dimensions of cognition do fluctuate according to biological time of day. And this is an example of one of those esoteric subjects, but we don't know if, for example, creativity might peak later in the day, or if, in the case of something like creativity, maybe it's more important for someone to take a break. And this is something that you can't really force, and rather it's when we give ourselves time for the mind to wander, whether that is going for a walk in nature without listening to anything and just paying attention to what's going on around you, or whether that is taking a nap, because clearly sleep is very important to coming up with creative solutions to problems that have previously proven too hard to solve. And there are all sorts of interesting, entertaining, historic examples of that we could flag. But I'll move on from this now because I think that your answer was pragmatic. And like you say, focusing on helping people get better sleep is the foundation on which to build many of these other practices. One of which is using your cognitive gears model. And just to pick up on what you were saying about chronotype and that distribution, because I know that you asked specifically about my thoughts on that. For people who are curious about that subject, I didn't mention this, but I interviewed Tommy for a previous episode of this podcast, and that was split into 2 episodes. But I first met Tommy when he asked me to be a guest on the Nourish, Balance, Thrive podcast. And we did a podcast about chronotype specifically, in which we went into what for a lot of people would probably be painful detail about the specifics of chronotype. But suffice it to say that I am one of those people who believes in chronotype. There are some, even circadian biologists, who dismiss it. And I push back against that because you see chronotypic variations in non-human animals under very tightly controlled, standardized light dark cycles. B, we do know something about the genetics of chronotype, and there are people with, for example, familial advanced sleep phase syndrome or familial delayed sleep phase syndrome, meaning that you have entire families of people who have very early or late sleep, respectively. And then C, you spoke about that population distribution. The thing that's difficult about this is that we all live under different so-called Zeitgeber strengths, meaning that some of us spend lots of time outdoors in daylight during the daytime and keep the lights down at night and sleep in dark rooms. So we have very strong time cues that anchor the timing of our body's clocks each day, whereas other people live in artificially lit environments. They spend very little time outdoors during the day, and then they turn the lights on full at night, and they sleep in bedrooms that have blue light emitting devices. And so if you look at the population, I think the chronotypic distributions that you see can be quite misleading. And the parallel that I'd be tempted to draw would be to that of body weight. In a modern context, you see a very broad distribution of body mass indices, for example. You see very light people, very heavy people, and it's skewed towards the heavy people because we live in such an obesogenic environment. And in the case of chronotype, because the human circadian clock is on average slightly longer than 24 hours, the distribution is probably more skewed towards later sleep wake times than what you would see if we had stronger time cues. If, for example, everyone permanently went camping. We'll move on from that. Exactly, on the equator. Yeah. We'll move on from that. And one of the things that I'm keen to ask you about is the fact that in some tasks, so for example, menial tasks that rely heavily on vigilance, we're prone to more errors with increasing time on task. And I'm therefore keen to ask for your recommendations regarding the best types and durations of breaks from work that people should take if they're looking to perform well, and also whether the duration of break should change across the working day.
So I think, there's been some really interesting reviews done recently, which have looked at micro breaks and which is what we're talking about, these kind of brief breaks during the workday. And it seems that generally, the more demanding a task is, the longer the break needs to be. In my view, one of the primary governors of how long a break should be actually is driven by how demanding the task is, perhaps more so than what time of day that task is conducted in. A recent review seems to suggest that about 10 minutes is kind of the sweet spot for a micro break. And it should be about 10 minutes long. But if it's very cognitively demanding, it probably should be longer than that. And so, the way I've often encouraged people to do this is to break their day down into kind of blocks of work. Sometimes in that peak period, Pomodoros can be quite helpful, where maybe every hour you have a 10-minute break, for example, and you extend the Pomodoros out if you can. So you're working for 50 minutes and then you have a 10-minute break. And typically people talk about 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off, but actually I find most people can get up and tolerate about 50 minutes and then take a 10-minute break. In terms of the content of a micro break, again, there's been some interesting studies on this, but if I was to synthesize that, I suggest that it seems that there's 4 quite important characteristics to try and optimize a micro break. And one of those is that I do think that a break should have some level of activity in it. physical activity. Again, the sports scientist speaks. But we know that work is quite sedentary often for knowledge workers. These long periods of sedentary time aren't great. And as we spoke about before, actually, if we are able to do some even light physical activity, that increase in heart rate, in arousal physiologically, is going to have a positive effect on that subsequent work, as well as having a long-term effect in terms of reducing sedentary time and the negative things that are associated with that. And so even kind of fairly brief bouts of activity can improve insulin sensitivity, for example, which is sometimes a marker of metabolic health. So there's an active component to a micro break, both which has an acute and a chronic benefit in my view. The second characteristic is that it does need to be relaxing. And by that, I mean, I think there needs to be a decrease in cognitive load. And so if you're working particularly on something intensely, there needs to be a relative decrease in cognitive load relative to that. And so that means do something where you're not having to pay close attention, where if you're having to be very vigilant, for example, as you mentioned, it doesn't require a lot of vigilance. And interestingly, this is perhaps one of the reasons why it seems that spending time in a natural versus an urban environment may be helpful during your break, because in an urban environment, you have to be very vigilant. So, for example, if you're working in an office and you go for a walk around central London, you've got to be vigilant for a lot of things. You don't want to get hit by a scooter, and you don't want your phone to be stolen, and you don't want to get hit by a taxi or knock into all the people who are walking in the opposite direction. So you want that decrease in cognitive load. But similarly, even if you're in your office, consider what you're doing during that time. Now, again, like you were saying, a lot of people get really kind of religious about this idea that we want to avoid screens before we go to bed. A terrible thing will happen. Interestingly, when people have done research into micro breaks, using social media, reading a magazine or something is actually associated with restoration. And so I'd say to people, don't be afraid of kind of scrolling a bit on your phone during your break if that's something that you enjoy. And actually, it seems that kind of if something's relaxing and it's associated with a boost in positive mood as well, that has an effect on restoring our resources. And it kind of relates to that conservation of resources theory that I talked about earlier. There's this restoration process that's associated with it that can then subsequently improve our well-being and our performance. So there's an active component, there's a relaxing component. A social component also seems to be important. So in one of these reviews that they did on micro breaks, they were comparing the effect of kind of social micro breaks with what they called nutrition breaks, which was just a clunky way of saying that people went for a coffee, essentially. And what they found is when they disentangled some of the confounders in that, that actually it wasn't the kind of having a coffee in the nutrition break that was effective. It was actually the social interaction that occurred during that break. And that providing that the topic of that social interaction was non-work related, it was restorative. So when you take a break, it seems that if there's a way that you can connect with people about a non-work related topic, it could be live. It could even just be sending a text message to a friend or maybe speaking to them. That seems to be helpful in the micro break. And the final component relates to something I touched on just a moment ago, and that's that there's some kind of natural aspect to the micro break. So there's this phenomena described as attention restoration theory, and it links in with your point about vigilance as well. And it distinguishes between the directed attention that we experience when we're at work with the effortless attention that we might experience in a natural environment. And there's some really interesting research that's been done kind of in that area that suggests that when we spend time in nature, relative to an urban environment, actually where it's been contrasted with, then that's associated with subsequent improvements in cognitive performance. And they measured that using something called a backwards digit span test, which looks at several aspects of cognitive performance. So encoding, maintenance, active processing, updating. Interestingly, even looking at pictures of nature was found to be effective. And they looked at it between, I think just about 10 minutes. But ideally, spend some time in a real natural environment, look at some trees, some leaves, clouds in the sky. If you can't, even looking at pictures of nature. But it seems that one of the mechanisms that's underlying that is that we do see some distinct patterns of brain activity associated with the natural fractal patterns that are on leaves on trees, clouds in the sky, waves breaking on the beach, which are then subsequently associated with improvements in cognitive performance following that recovery. They'd be my kind of 4 top tips for the micro breaks: that active, relaxing, social, natural, based on a kind of synthesis of the review literature. Ideally 10 minutes longer if the task is more cognitively demanding. And then it's an interesting question, does that vary over the course of the day? I mean, my inclination would be to say that as your fatigue increases over the day, work could potentially become more cognitively demanding. You probably need a bit of a longer break. And I think that's, again, it's pragmatic. I haven't got data to support that. But it perhaps relates to your question as well about, do different aspects of our cognitive performance change over the course of the day? There's some interesting evidence to indicate that during that rebound period in our day, it seems that there's perhaps a reduction in cognitive inhibition, specifically inhibitory control. So our ability to resist proponent responses, which you might find in practice means that you're a little bit more distractible, for example. But there is the potential, I think, that might be quite conducive to creative ideation, because if your response inhibition is very, very high, when this new kind of little idea pops in, you might be more likely to bat it away and stay very goal-directed on the task that you're focused on. However, if your inhibition is a bit lower, it may help you to be more open to some of these ideas that emerge. And so my inclination would be to suggest that you have shorter focused 10-minute breaks earlier in the day with those 4 components when you're in those focus blocks. Later in the day, when you start to be a bit more distracted, a bit more fatigued anyway, maybe take a more extended break, a 20-minute walk, for example, or maybe half an hour, and just let your mind wander and see what happens. And there's some interesting evidence actually around this idea of time spent in default mode where we're task negative and how that's subsequently associated with creativity. So I do think that there are these changes in different cognitive functions or cognitive capabilities over the course of the day. There's perhaps a way to operationalize that, but I could certainly learn more about that and some of the literature that's already there. And I think based on my understanding of what's there, there's still some more academic work to be done to maybe start to disentangle some of those changes over the course of the day.
One other thing that's probably worth mentioning, going back to something we discussed previously, is that the sleep-deprived human brain tends to oscillate more between activity in the default mode network and strong activity in the frontoparietal attention network, which is why you experience more intrusions, distraction during tasks in which you're trying to focus. And so my guess is that it could also be that it would benefit people to take slightly longer breaks if they haven't been sleeping very well recently or getting enough sleep specifically. But I was just wondering, James, about what you think are some of the best recovery activities between work days as well.
There's quite a good body of literature around this, and one of the dominant frameworks by Sabine Sonnentag was described as the recovery experience framework. And so she defined several recovery experiences which you'd argue are critical for recovery. And they're detachment, so experiencing this sense of mental distance from work. Again, relaxation, so that there's this physical decrease in load as well as a cognitive decrease in load. She also talked about mastery experiences, so taking opportunities to learn something new, ideally that's not work related. And then also the experience of control, so having a sense of autonomy over how you deploy your energy and spend your time between work. And so that recovery experience framework, I think, is quite helpful in classifying the dimensions of effective recovery between work days, so in your non-work time. There's another body of research as well by a guy called Professor Mark Cropley, and he has got a particular interest in a phenomenon described as work-related rumination, and so perseverative thinking about work. And he described a different framework which also includes psychological detachment, the sense of mental distance from work, like Sabine Sonnentag, but also talks about problem-solving pondering and affective rumination. And so his argument, and the researchers that work with him, is that after work you can characterize often people's experience in these 3 dimensions. And so some people are detachers, they just experience this sense of mental distance, or they get there eventually. But some people are problem-solving ponderers. So they're people who think about work and maybe just reflect on some of their challenges and the things that they're going to do. And then there's the affective ruminators, and this is associated with worry, essentially. Affective rumination is worrying. And the interesting thing is that the research indicates that actually the problem-solving pondering isn't really associated with negative outcomes. It's the affective rumination. And they've done some studies even looking at the association between those dimensions and heart rate variability, for example, and heart rate variability being a kind of index of your psychophysiological resources and quite a helpful indicator of your recovery status as well. And it does seem that that affective rumination has a physiological impact because we can't switch off, we don't detach, our resources continue to be drained, and you actually see that manifest physiologically as lower heart rate variability, which would indicate a kind of suppression of that parasympathetic rest and digest nervous system. But the problem-solving pondering isn't an issue, and so how I talk about this in practice. There's a challenge in this wellbeing space sometimes that I think that some of the recommendations are unrealistic and perhaps unhelpful. And so similarly, there's this idea that we want to avoid our coffee for 90 minutes in the day, and we want to avoid looking at screens before we go to bed. And it's all about this kind of ascetic, almost monk-like existence. And sometimes that translates into how we approach suggesting that people think about work or avoid thinking about work. And so people say, you must psychologically detach. You must not think about work in your free time. And I think that for many people, they don't want to, and that's fine. And we can talk about psychological detachment, because I think in answer to your question, what is the number one thing that people can do to recover effectively between work days? I do think that getting to the point that you experience some kind of mental distance from work is really critical. And actually one of the papers in my PhD research was focused on that specifically in some of the ways that we can achieve it. But actually, I think it's also important to say that problem-solving pondering, just reflecting on work, maybe you're going for a walk or you're sitting on the sofa and you're thinking about what you're going to do, and maybe you come up with some good ideas for how you can fix something, actually isn't really associated with negative health outcomes, and kind of give yourself permission to do that. And I know many people who really love their jobs, who are quite passionate about them, who enjoy doing that. But still, look for those recovery experiences, the opportunity to relax. Mastery experiences can be really helpful where you're engaged in something else, particularly for people who find it difficult to get a sense of mental distance. Engaging in hobbies, for example. Control is really critical. And again, that's one of the reasons why it can be helpful to put the devices away. Isn't necessarily the bright light. It's actually that you are on someone else's agenda when those emails are coming in. And actually putting the device away is a way to take back control of your time and experience that autonomy, which seems to be really critical. And then if you are kind of problem-solving pondering, great. For some people, you can switch that affective rumination into problem-solving pondering, which can help you to recover. And one of the ways to do that for some people is simply, if you're worrying about something, take a moment to note down what you're worrying about, maybe put an action in place to help you to address it in the future. And that could be as simple as scheduling some time the next day to try and tackle that thing you're worrying about. And that kind of step, that proactive step, can sometimes help people to shift into problem-solving pondering and reduce their stress, and then help them to achieve this sense of mental distance. So they're just some non-sleep methods of helping people to recover more effectively between the work days. And I think physical activity is a good part of it as well. And that because I've not published the data yet, I've written up this paper, and so I can't kind of reveal everything yet. But one of the things I did look at was comparing the effects of alcohol relative to physical activity on the experience of psychological detachment and the subsequent effect on physiological recovery. And what I will say is there is already existing evidence to show that alcohol can be quite effective in helping you to psychologically detach, but it's terrible for your physiological recovery, and maybe physical activity might be a better option. But there's all kinds of nuances there that hopefully we can discuss if that thing manages to get accepted somewhere. But in general, it's about relaxation, mastery experiences, being able to experience a sense of psychological detachment, having a level of autonomy and control, and then being aware of this affective rumination and try and switch that into problem-solving pondering if you can. They'd be my kind of top tips for recovery, above sleep, of course, which is, I would say, is the number one, getting adequate sleep during the time between work days.
Very practical. Thanks, James. And I'll add that heroin is probably very effective at creating psychological distance, but might not be in your best interests in terms of physiological recovery. But I was just thinking as you were speaking there, that in terms of breaks, there's a trace of a paradox here in that while greater time on task is associated with more errors in some tasks, task switching is also associated with impaired performance. And thinking about task switching, I've heard you refer to data from rescue time, suggesting that we check in with communication tools every 6 minutes on average. And obviously, task switching is one of the core components of cognitive load. So, do you have any recommendations regarding how people can minimize task switching and better focus during cognitively demanding activities?
Yeah, so I think some of it is just very practical again, and it's about things like switching off notifications. That's definitely one of the things you can do. I mean, one of the models that I find helpful when I think about cognitive load, to make it really practical, is something called the cognitive task load model, and it's a commonly used method for measuring mental workload. It's often used in human factors research, where people are trying to optimize human-machine interfaces, so how you use some kind of computing system often. And when we're using cognitive abilities during any task, doing cognitive work, we're using a different range of abilities. And you referred to some of these earlier, things like executive functions, decision making, organization, planning, attention, working memory, goal management. And so it would be wonderful if we could measure all these things and there are ways that you can, but in practice, you're not going to do that during your workday. And I find that the cognitive task load tool is a really simple way to summarize how we can apply and distribute those capabilities and how that impacts cognitive work during the day. And so what I encourage people to do, if you're going to think about how you manage cognitive load and avoid cognitive overload, you can think about the 3 dimensions that are in this cognitive task load model. So dimension 1 is time pressure, dimension 2 is switching, and dimension 3 is complexity. And so ideally what you want to try and do is manipulate one or maybe even all of those dimensions so that you're minimizing unnecessary cognitive load. And so dimension 1 is time pressure. And simply it's the amount of time that we spend working on an activity relative to what's available. And basically, if we feel that we're under time pressure, then that means that generally cognitive load will increase. And so one of the things that you can do practically is make sure you're realistic about how much time you're giving yourself for the task that you're doing. And we've all fallen victim to the planning fallacy. Generally, we're terrible at estimating how much time something will take, and we generally underestimate it. So if you're working in that peak period, for example, I encourage people to be conservative about their expectations in terms of how much work they're trying to do. Because if you're not, what you'll find is you put yourself under unnecessary time pressure, and then that will actually potentially unnecessarily increase your cognitive load. The second dimension is switching, and this is the one that you obviously referred to, because we know that switching between tasks increases cognitive load. The more we switch, the more cognitive load increases. And so this relates to your kind of paradox question as well, because obviously if sustained attention for a long period over time, we might see an increase in cognitive load. But then if we switch, we're also increasing load. It's one of the reasons why in that Pomodoro technique, which I referred to earlier, typically people talk about 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off. But ideally, I'd be encouraging people to try and extend the duration of those Pomodoros, those intervals, out to 50 minutes, because you're reducing your switching cost then. Rather than switching every 25, you're switching every 50. And that's probably closer towards a kind of sweet spot in terms of sustained attention. But also then it relates to that point of switching off your notifications. There was a really interesting piece of research that looked at what happened when our phone was in our presence. We could see it even if it wasn't switched on. And it was a study that looked at the near presence of your smartphone and its effect on cognitive performance. And from memory, I think that the presence of your smartphone could decrease your cognitive performance from memory by about 7%, or something like that. And so, really a profound effect. And so I encourage people during those peak periods, it's not just about switching off notifications, actually put your phone out of sight. In the study that they did, they looked at several different positions of the phone, and one was kind of visible, one was in their pocket, one was actually kind of in the room with them. And even though when they asked people to assess whether they felt the phone was impairing their performance, people didn't think it did. They thought if it's switched off, it's not going to affect me. If it's out of sight, it definitely won't. but actually their perception was disconnected from the reality. So get the phone out of the way if you're in that peak period, because its presence will be unnecessarily increasing cognitive load, decreasing cognitive performance. The third dimension is complexity. This refers to kind of activities that require this effortful thinking rather than relying on something that's automated, a subroutine that you don't need to pay conscious attention to. And generally, the more complex the task, the more effortful thinking that's required, the higher the cognitive load. And so think about that. You can't necessarily always control for that, but it's worth thinking about, again, in terms of that kind of timing and level of alertness. So there's not a lot of point trying to do your most complex tasks during the time that you already feel incredibly sleepy and with low alertness and very distractible. And so it's, again, just being practical about when you schedule that really demanding work. And so the thing I'd encourage people to do to try to minimize unnecessary mental load and optimize their cognitive performance is to think about those three dimensions and how you optimize them or improve them. Don't create unnecessarily time pressure. Don't switch if you don't need to. And accept that the most complex work is probably going to be most effectively done during those periods in the day that you naturally feel able to sustain your attention and work with your biology rather than against it.
I know that you've likened knowledge work to endurance activity many times, James. And I'd just like to pause and reflect on some of the parallels between knowledge work and exercise training. The first person that I heard refer to these types of parallels was actually Andrew Hill, who you might know. He's particularly interested in neurofeedback, and he has formulated nootropic products and is very good at helping people improve their brain function in many ways. But you mentioned previously the idea of extending Pomodoro intervals over time, which in my mind parallels the concept of progressive load. Some people refer to overload, but I never like that term because you're not really overloading, because if you're overloading the structure, then it'll probably at some point break. But on this subject, James, I was just wondering about whether you could mention some parallels to exercise and maybe specifically some exercise training principles. I'm thinking about things like periodization, specific adaptations to impose demands, and refer to ones that we haven't mentioned so far in this particular conversation, because I think we've spoken a bit about the importance of interspersing periods of rest between bouts of activity, and we've spoken a bit about the concept of progressive load, but we've maybe touched less on some of those other principles.
Yeah. And it's a good question because it's a very easy kind of thing to throw around, isn't it? This idea that cognitive work is an endurance activity, or knowledge work is an endurance activity, without really thinking about what those parallels are in practice. And generally, I've kind of conceptualized probably 7 frameworks from sports science that I think apply quite well to what I describe as the endurance activity of knowledge work. And one of those is this idea of progressive overload. And because I think that you see that in practice, and sometimes, again, you'll hear people kind of suggest that you should have 4 hours of deep work every day, for example. But if you haven't even ever really done an hour of focus work without distraction, or maybe you haven't done it for years since you got a smartphone, it's quite a big ask. And so one of these principles of progressive overload is recognizing that, as you say, you might start with 25 minutes of focus in a Pomodoro and add 5 minutes or 10 minutes a week and gradually build up. And again, it's part of my kind of strongly held view that we do need to take a more human and realistic approach to well-being a lot of the time, rather than having these kind of ascetic, kind of hyper-disciplined, sometimes quite forceful approaches to well-being and human optimization, which is a phrase that sometimes I'm a bit resistant to, if I'm honest. I think the second principle is about recovery, and we've talked about that quite a lot. We know that recovery in sport is crucial, and we know that because the evidence of overtraining, non-functional overreaching is so clear. You'll see physical injuries, for example. There are biological markers which we can measure and see that someone's body isn't tolerating the load anymore, because often they aren't recovering adequately. I think the challenge in knowledge work is that the negative effects are often substantially delayed. They don't emerge for a long time. And sometimes it's because we see that J-shaped curve that we described earlier, the fact that people don't realize they're under-recovered until it's too late, until there's this catastrophic drop-off. So in the similar way that when you're working with an athlete, often the coach's role, particularly if you're working with a high performer, is often to stop the athlete from working too hard. If you're working with real high performers, the role of the coach is often to hold them back a bit, because you'll find these people who've got huge appetites for workload, for effort. And you see that in the workplace as well, sometimes with high performers, just simply because there's so many opportunities to work, even if someone isn't particularly intrinsically motivated. So I think this idea that recovery periods are critical, and actually those recovery periods are what is facilitating and might even improve the quality of our work. In a sporting context, it's about adaptation, but in a knowledge work context, it might be about growth, kind of in your career and in your progression, that actually you're going to do better if you recover. And so the idea of recovery is really key. To your point of talking about something slightly different that we've not touched on before, there's also this idea of rating of perceived exertion in sports science, there's this. I think my view is that there's this increasing recognition of the importance of RPE, of rating of perceived exertion, in sports science. For quite a long time, people discarded it, and there was this kind of view of sports science that was almost entirely physiological, that almost kind of stopped at the neck, and we thought about everything down, but not really a lot of what went up here. And also, even when people did, it was from a very neurophysiological point of view. But we're starting to recognize the importance of psychology in sports science. And I think there's this really interesting kind of melding, which has been described as the psychobiological model of fatigue, where we're recognizing that factors like our perception of effort and our motivation, these quite subjective psychological factors that rely on us asking people how they feel, can have a measurable effect in terms of your performance mechanically and how much work you can actually do. And I think that this is important in knowledge work as well, particularly because of the kind of phenomenon that I described earlier, that we often take a very industrial view of knowledge work, that's been driven by the kind of the industrial factory-driven working patterns of, over 100 years ago. And as a consequence, we don't often check in with ourselves and ask, how effortful is this work? And is it consistent with my energy levels? Unfortunately, many people don't have the luxury to be able to even ask that question or change their work as a result of it. And, again, I think that relates to work culture. But if you've got some level of autonomy, I encourage people to check in and consider how effortful their work is and whether that effort is aligned with those natural rhythms. And also think about the quality of their effort. I mean, sometimes you can think about effort just on a simple scale of 1 to 10, where 10 is maximal, 1 is minimal. And sometimes one of the things I encourage people to do is one of the things that's what you do to measure RPE in sports science. If you've ever done an exercise test, a VO2 max test or something, where you go to your maximum kind of level of effort, there's always someone standing at the side of you with a clipboard with this scale of 1 to 10, or whatever it is. It might be an adjusted Borg scale. And initially they say to you, where are you on the scale? And you say 3 or 4, and then by the end of it, you can't even speak. You're just kind of reaching out and hoping that they know that it's a 10 on the scale. But sometimes I've actually got people to go through this process during the day of setting up a spreadsheet and simply noting down during the day their alertness and their level of effort, and just starting to pay a bit more attention to their perception of effort and thinking about whether they can structure their day in a way where the effort that they make is more consistent with their natural levels of energy and alertness, for example. So there's that overload, or kind of progressive overload, recovery, the RPE, how that relates to that psychobiological model of fatigue. And I think periodization is a really interesting one as well, because it's such a fundamental part of sports performance. And your listeners may be familiar with it already, but essentially it's about strategically planning training schedules so you achieve your best performance at the right time for competition, ideally. And you break down training years or even multiple years into these blocks of mesocycles, microcycles, macrocycles overall. And also there's this recognition within a periodized training program that it's not possible to work on everything at the same time. So you might always kind of have, for example, an endurance component in there, but there'll be periods where maybe you de-emphasize endurance slightly because you're trying to build some muscle mass and then subsequently some strength and power, for example. But we've kind of lost, we've never really had a conception of that in knowledge work. And it leads to this always on way of working, where not just day to day, but week to week and month to month, it's just persistent effort. And then we'll have a holiday and we'll try and switch off and then we're back up again. And occasionally we think about recovery after intense periods. And so like an athlete would recognize that in a competition period, following that competition period, you'd need some kind of recovery to regenerate, because the competition is a time where you are actually broken down. And so in a workplace context, in management consulting, for example, there's sometimes this idea that after you've done a really intense project, you have a period where the intensity reduces in your work. Sometimes people call it a beach period, where then you'll kind of regenerate before you go on to another case following that. But the principle that I've never seen applied in knowledge work is the idea of the taper. Because in a periodized training program for an athlete, you would generally reduce training load quite significantly leading up to important competition periods. So you do all that training focused on all those different capacities at different times for endurance, times biased towards strength and power, maybe skill development in certain sports as well. And then hopefully you bake that cake or you bake the loaf of bread. And just like kind of a loaf of bread, you want it to rest for a little while before you eat it. And so, in practice with an athlete, what that would mean is generally you'll maintain the intensity of the training, but you might reduce the volume for a period of time leading up to that performance, maybe by 50%. And the purpose of that is to allow that kind of adaptation, but also to make sure the athlete is fresh and ready to perform and that their resources are fully restored, that fuel tank is at maximum capacity, knowing that competition is likely to break them down. And I think there's a principle there that we can take into knowledge work where if you can predict when these really demanding periods are coming, your competition period, and in management consulting, it might be the time before a big project or a particular case. In the finance sector, it might be the time between deals, for example, or when you know that you're going to be put onto a new deal. Sometimes it's around a financial year. To actually not just focus on the recovery from intense effort, but proactively think about restoring your resources in the lead up to it by reducing load, being a bit kinder to yourself, taking a bit of time off maybe scheduling a few longer breaks during the day, prioritizing your sleep, so that when you go into that intense period, your resources are replenished and you've got a chance of performing at your best rather than starting depleted and being broken down. And I think that does relate to my final point, which is this idea around polarized training intensity distribution. And again, that originated in endurance sport. And essentially, it was a method where most of the training volume was either very, very easy, low intensity, and quite a small portion was very, very hard, with very little at this medium intensity. And I think that could be translated both at a micro level day to day into knowledge work, but also over a longer period as well. Some of it is about applying that cognitive gears model. It's about focusing your effort in these intense periods of high cognitive gear work, where you're not distracted, where you're trying to minimize those dimensions of cognitive task load so that you can really get your best work done. And then really focusing on effective recovery and trying to minimize this moderate intensity work, this cognitive middle gear where you're switching, where you're not really focused on anything. You're never going to get rid of that, but you can perhaps reduce it. So you polarize your cognitive work in the same way that an endurance athlete polarizes physical work. And the effect of that for an endurance athlete, seems to be that it improves adaptations, because this middle gear is fatiguing, but it's not particularly productive. And that middle zone, similarly for an athlete, is fatiguing, but not particularly productive in terms of adaptations. And I think that polarized model more generally can be applied to say, when we switch on, really switch on. And when you switch off, really effectively switch off. Apply those recovery principles that we spoke about a moment ago around, relaxation, mastery, having a sense of autonomy, and then also that psychological detachment, getting that adequate sleep, and then really switching on so that you can do your best work. And it's that polarization, that kind of on and off rather than the middle gear, that I think can be quite helpful for both athletes and for business people. So hopefully that elucidates my kind of idea of how sports science frameworks might apply to knowledge work. But they'd be the big ones: progressive overload recovery, RPE, psychobiological model, and then thinking about periodization and polarization of work as well.
That's great. And I'll just quickly throw a few more in the mix too. And I'm not saying by any means that they're as important as the ones that you just mentioned, James, but I think they're interesting nonetheless. One of them is the concept of performance profiling that's often used
That's
when
great.
working with athletes specifically. And so maybe someone identifies, for example, that they're really struggling to pay attention for consolidated bouts of work. And then they focus on improving their ability to pay attention, both through changes in their work structure, changes in distractors, and also maybe some specific activities that enhance their ability to pay attention. So, one of these, for example, might be focused attention based mindfulness training. That brings up the subject of specific adaptations to imposed demands. And you spoke about polarized training there. Relevant to that is the concept of concurrent training. And we can't keep getting bigger, stronger, and improving our cardio respiratory fitness at maximal rates all at the same time. And so instead, we need to prioritize certain things at different times. And there's evidence of the relevance of this to cognitive functions too. So when I spoke to Tommy, for example, he discussed how when taxi drivers learned the knowledge, there were structural changes in their brain, specifically in the hippocampus during that training, but there were also some other changes in the brain elsewhere that indicated that certain parts of the brain atrophied during that period. And similarly, one of my criticisms of Tommy's paper, I just sent him a message after reading it, and it wasn't really a criticism, it was more just part of my personal biases, but they didn't include mindfulness within the paper. And I thought that was a glaring omission, because mindfulness is interesting in that while people speak about it as if it's just a single entity, it's something that you can tune for very specific outcomes. Tanya Singh has done some very interesting work on this. So, for example, if you're doing focused attention meditation where you're zeroing in on something specifically, such as your breath, you will improve your ability to pay attention in general. However, if you want to improve how you feel about other people and increase your feelings of compassion, then it would make more sense to engage in what's known as metta or loving kindness practice. And then another one related to this is the concept of use disuse. And this is modeled in various different ways, but a classic example would be bed rest. If people are curious about this, they can look at the old Dallas bed rest studies, which I'm sure you're familiar with, James. You probably recall those from your undergrad in sport and exercise science at Loughborough University. But basically, they took healthy young people and they had them rest in bed for several weeks, and there were dramatic reductions in various different measures of their physical function, which they then regained on subsequent training. And this can be modeled in other ways too. So microgravity is another one that's been used in the case of non-human animals. Things like hind limb unloading experiments are done. And then finally, borrowing from motor learning, there's also the idea of blocked versus random practice schedules. And in blocked practice, you would just practice the same thing over and over again. And that leads to quick short term gains in performance in the relevant domain. But if people want to get better in the long term and they want to be able to take the skills they're learning and apply them to different contexts, they want what's known as transfer of training. Random practice schedules are better, in which they're moving over the course of the day or the training unit between different types of tasks. And I think that's also relevant to knowledge work. This is a massive digression, James. But when I spoke with Tommy, he recommended a book named The Coddling of the American Mind. And I didn't realize when he mentioned it that I'd read the article that the authors published in The Atlantic, which is freely available and people should definitely read if they haven't read the book. But the book is terrific too. And one of the things that they discuss is how problematic so called safetyism is. And this is the idea that safety must be prioritized above all else. And ironically, that can actually worsen resilience. And there's an aphorism that I love from the book, and I forget who this is attributed to, but it's that we should prepare the child for the road, not the road for the child. I was wondering about whether you think safetyism is now pervading the workplace, especially given that we live in what is a very woke society.
That's a real digression, isn't it? So that's a tangent and a half. Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing to consider, particularly if you're working in very high performance environments. And I've had some very interesting conversations with people in some very demanding workplaces who anecdotally have noted that it seems that some people, kind of a younger generation coming into the workforce, appear to be kind of less willing to apply effort and suffer essentially at work, and that they're much more interested in their well-being, and they've got very, very high expectations about how the workplace will support that. And I think it's possible to take both those approaches to the extreme, because I think that if you prepare the child for the road and you take that to its extreme, you're basically saying that we don't have any responsibility for taking care of the road or addressing any of road-based factors. And in a workplace context, you can take that to an extreme, and you can basically say, essentially, our role is to toughen people up. They need to operate in our working culture, and if they can't handle it, they can get out. And actually, that was pervasive in many working environments, particularly in the finance sector, for example, in some management consulting firms. And in my view, it's analogous to the old East German sports system, which was basically you take as many kids as you can who meet the requirements out of a sports school, or into a sports school, and then out of that sports school. And metaphorically speaking, you take your dozen eggs, you throw them against the wall, and you see which ones don't break.
Which is also the current Chinese system.
Yeah. And the problem is with that approach, I think, is that there might be some people within that system, some eggs, that perhaps with a slightly more nurturing approach may have met or even exceeded the potential of the eggs that didn't break. And also the problem with that approach is, in terms of a developmental process, it's very easy to confuse causation and correlation. So you can say that this hard environment is what supported this peak performance, whereas actually it might just be that people happened to survive through it, and it wasn't those kind of tough factors that really predicted the kind of the exceptional outcomes. So I'm really resistant to this idea that we don't have, as employers, as workplaces, any responsibility for the road in that metaphor. I think we do. I think we need to be thoughtful about it. At the same time, I think that there needs to be a recognition that it is important to take some level of personal responsibility, but also responsibility as kind of leaders, as coaches, to help people to survive and thrive in challenging environments. We can't remove all the stresses, and actually we know that it would be a bad thing if we did. There's this principle in sports psychology called the Rocky Road, and it describes that actually if you want to help an athlete reach their full potential, not just as a sports person, but also as a human being, then actually carefully exposing them to struggle is a really important part of that developmental process. And it's interesting that they talk about this metaphor of the road as well, and this idea that actually you might selectively put rocks in the road in a very controlled and kind of thoughtful way that the athlete needs to overcome. And so, that could often mean giving athletes increasing responsibility. But I know some coaches who have deliberately created challenge in less important competitions to put rocks in the road, metaphorically speaking, that the athlete needs to overcome. So, for example, deliberately turning up late and not giving the athlete the time to go through their full pre-performance routine before they compete. And the reason being that is the reality of competition. Most elite, even the best athletes in the world, they don't necessarily have an optimized schedule. Sometimes they've got to go from one competition to another. A flight is delayed, and they need to, if they've never had to cope with that kind of uncertainty and that kind of challenge, they've never faced those rocks and learned that you can sometimes not do your whole pre-performance routine and still be okay, then they really struggle. And so there's this recognition in elite athlete development or long-term athlete development that you need this kind of struggle involved. And actually, I think that in a workplace context, there's a role to actually selectively and thoughtfully provide environments where people do need to struggle and grow, because if we don't, people won't adapt. So I think that, and my view is that there is a risk sometimes that we, in some contexts, we have kind of coddled people, that we've tried to make the road too smooth, and we've done people a disservice as a consequence of that, because they've not been able to adapt and grow to reach their potential, and maybe maybe suffered more or not kind of experienced as much as they could. They've not had a kind of full experience, or perhaps when they have experienced struggle, they're not prepared. But you can definitely go too far the other way, and actually, I think that you can use that as an excuse sometimes. I think this idea that we need to prepare the child for the road, metaphorically speaking, to actually not take responsibility for making an environment where people are going to reach their potential. And rather than carefully thinking about the stresses that people are exposed to and doing that in a way that genuinely doesn't overload them, back to your normal point, it's just a progressive stimulus that helps them to adapt. Actually, there's a kind of a dereliction of duty of care, and actually we can end up burning people out and doing them harm. So my view is that there's some truth in that, but the expression of it practically needs to be done thoughtfully and with care, so that we don't accidentally go too far one way or the other.
I attended a conference when I did an internship at the Rugby Football Union after my undergrad, and the theme of the conference was, does talent require trauma? Because if you look at the Lance Armstrongs and Tiger Woodses of the world, so many of them have daddy issues, and that's probably not just a coincidence. But just to wrap up, James, I'm conscious of A, how generous you've been with your time, so thank you so much for that. But B, we've got through about half of questions that I wanted to ask you. As is always the case with me, I can be very long-winded, unfortunately, especially when you start asking me questions, James. But I'd love to end with some of your quick thoughts. We're going to go for a rapid fire round on technology mostly, but certain subjects that are especially topical right now. First of these is, when you look at the landscape of consumer technology to enhance cognition at the moment, are there any products that particularly intrigue you?
Yeah. I mean, there's one I came across recently, funny enough, because our mutual friend, Dr. Tommy Wood, mentioned it. It's called Brain HQ, which is kind of online brain training. And I was kind of intrigued because it seems that there's some evidence for these kind of online or kind of digital-based kind of brain training games or methods. There's some indications that the skills that you develop or the capabilities that you enhance through that training with these Brain HQ kind of interventions actually have generalizable effects. I've not looked into this in enough detail yet, but until Tommy had mentioned this, my view generally of these kind of digital brain training interventions was that all it does is make you better at the intervention. It makes you better at the game. There's nothing generalizable. Whereas actually it seems that there might be some generalizable effects. So I need to look into that in more detail, but that's something that's kind of just on my horizon, just kind of popped up that I'd like to look into. And I think that just in terms of general kind of consumer-based cognitive performance enhancement, I'm generally pretty skeptical, to be honest. I don't really think there's any slam dunks out there. And, I know that there's even some people starting to talk about, that have been talking for a while about transcranial direct current stimulation. But my view of that is when it's been, again, compared in terms of looking at potential to enhance specific aspects of cognitive performance, like memory, for example, it doesn't seem to outperform, for example, the effect of physical activity on improving memory. And so my view is that there's some interesting things potentially, but for most people, it really is about the low-hanging fruit and addressing these basics. And again, this is terrible for social media because everybody wants to know about the new app or the hack or the or the supplement. And sometimes I wish I'd kind of gone down a different path and launched a supplement company because people seem to be happy to buy anything. And I think there's potential in nutrition and cognitive performance, absolutely. And I think there's some supplements which show promise. But generally speaking, my answers are pretty dull. It's like there's really no point, as you said, too many people majoring in the minors. There's no point thinking about these kind of esoteric and emerging cognitive performance enhancement strategies if you're not sleeping enough and you've got completely unmanageable levels of stress. Start with that and then build from there.
I'm a Luddite at heart, so you're speaking to me, James, but I'll add that if you haven't come across them before, there are some interesting closed loop brain training systems that are being developed. And these have several advantages. One of them is that they can make sure that the tasks that people are doing are challenging but doable. Another is that they can make them more immersive to make the user experience more engaging. So some of them are also using things like augmented reality. And some of the initial work that's been done on this has been by Adam Ghazali. And my guess is just that those have more potential than just canned brain training programs like Brain HQ, which isn't to say that Brain HQ hasn't been proven helpful so far, because it clearly has, and it's been very well researched compared to most of these types of programs. But anyway, back to the very rapid fire questions.
That was not rapid fire, was it?
No, it was. You're a scientist, James. I expect it.
I actually forgot that you said it was rapid fire. I just got completely carried away. So we'll get back to it.
Going back to something you said at the start, we have ChatGPT and large language models rippling across the landscape, and was just curious about whether you've got any thoughts about how to best understand to use them successfully if they are going to be very important to the future of knowledge work.
I mean, I think there's huge potential there. One of the reasons being that it has got the potential to automate so many easily repeatable tasks or very explainable tasks. A few years ago, people said, if you can clearly define your role and describe it, the tasks associated with it, it will probably be automated. And there's an argument that we're there now, because with the appropriate prompts, models like ChatGPT can do incredible amounts of work for you. So I think really the future, and the way I'm thinking about this, is how can we work with these machines by making sure that the machines, and by that I mean large language models, for example, and these other tools, how can they take care of these kind of repeatable tasks, the work that can be codified and described quite clearly as prompts? And then what does that leave us to do as humans, and how can we double down on making sure that we can do that as well as possible? And that's why, for example, I see that there's these opportunities for partnership where increasingly it becomes about the creativity that emerges from our effective collaboration with other people, assisted by these tools. And I've started to see this in practice with some of the projects I'm involved in now, where, for example, experimenting with quite narrow large language models, so not so large language models, trained on more focused data sets for specific purposes. And I've been involved in some collaborative projects where we almost work with that tool as a team member. And it's just been an incredible experience of, it plays the role of maybe 3 people in a team, and we throw questions at it and ideas and the synthesis, which we then iterate as a group. And actually, I think where we're at the moment, the output often isn't production ready, whether that was code, whether that was some kind of creative output. But I think it's got the potential to massively accelerate potentially the quality and the quantity of content of the things that we can do. There's also the potential in terms of democratizing access to data science. Some people may have already got access to some of the tools in ChatGPT, Code Interpreter, for example, that's able to essentially act as a highly qualified data scientist. It will ingest raw CSV files and do all kinds of sophisticated analyses and create visualizations and output. And again, I think if you prompt it with the right information, you take that output and think about the impact that it can make in the right context. I think the future looks very bright. There's obviously dystopian perspectives on this as well, in terms of what it means for jobs being displaced. I think that is a reality. But in general, my summary is look for ways we can partner in a smart way with these tools and double down on the things that the unique human capabilities that are least automatable, so that we can hopefully have a more positive impact in the world and accelerate human progress as a result of that.
I don't think we can record a podcast without at least mentioning the bane of the existence of many people, namely email. And you posted on LinkedIn that June 12th to 18th was National Email Week in the US, which is exceedingly depressing. Who came up with that? I've got no idea. Maybe it was some Gmail director or something. But on one end of the spectrum, you've got the likes of Cal Newport, who are trying to envision the potential of a world without email, which might be hyperbolic. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have people whose working lives are answering emails. So what are your brief thoughts on what listeners can do to use email more efficiently?
I think it's being really clear about what your communication tools are best suited to. And I think that also just generally, what communication is most appropriate for a given purpose. So I can't talk about email without just talking about meetings as well, because a huge number of meetings are a complete waste of time. And one of the simplest things that people can do is actually say, as I mentioned earlier, could this meeting be replaced with a single well-worded email? So actually, I think that meetings are often the biggest time suck for many people, the biggest debt. With emails, once those meetings have been converted into emails, what do you do with all the emails? And I think that some of this is about just recognizing your motivation behind sending the email and who you include on it. So a huge amount of email traffic that I see that people get is actually them being CC'd in because someone in that mix wants to make sure that you know that they're productive, and you don't actually need to be on the email at all. And this goes back to this idea of psychological safety again, that if you've got a culture where people are really concerned that you don't think they're productive and you don't think they're doing their job, you'll massively increase your email traffic because they'll constantly feel the need to prove themselves by either CCing you on emails that you don't need to be CC'd on, or by asking you questions which they could answer on their own, but they're not secure enough to do it. So there's a cultural piece as leaders in terms of email. On the flip side, if you're not a leader, be asking yourself that question: do you really need to send that email or include it, or could you make the decision on your own? If you don't feel confident, there's maybe a cultural issue to address there that maybe you could follow up on. But then very practically, I think this is old news. People have heard it a million times. Rather than checking in on your communication tools every 6 minutes, which some evidence would indicate we do, try and block that email into periods of your day where maybe you are feeling a bit more distractible anyway, assuming that the email responses don't need to be in depth and require a lot of complex cognitive processing. If that kind of rebounds when you're a bit more distracted anyway, try and block it into that part of the day, blast off a load of replies if you need to, so that you're protecting those high gear periods for that real quality work, which is going to help you keep your job when ChatGPT comes calling. And so they'd be my three top tips. I think email can be a great tool, particularly if it replaces meetings. But it is just that, a tool. It's hopefully not something that takes over your entire life.
And also, if you reply to emails out of hours, then you're probably conditioning people to expect to get responses from you out of hours. Not that this is something that I've witnessed firsthand in my personal life or anything.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. And as leaders, I was talking to someone the other day who likes to send their emails at 4 a.m. And one of the things I encouraged them to do was set a time delay so that the email goes out a couple of hours later, because subconsciously you can be sending a signal as a leader that high performance in this company means doing your emails at 4 a.m. Where actually we know, as you mentioned, with chronotype and people's circadian phase, that might not be helpful. So just being mindful of the subconscious messages we're sending, not just in terms of the content of the email, but also the timing of that.
Last question, James. What are 2 or 3 of your favorite books about learning, productivity, or the future of work? I heard that you mentioned that recently you've had your head in academic papers and probably just staring at paragraphs from your PhD, thinking, did I really write that? But if you think about your history of reading such books, which are the ones come to mind?
I should have prepped for this, because I feel like genuinely at the moment I've been so deep just into academic literature. I've not actually read a book cover back to back, a non-academic kind of textbook or paper for a long time. I think one of the ones that had a big influence on me was Deep Work that you referenced by Cal Newport, and I think that some of the content in there is quite extreme, but actually, I think he did an amazing job of highlighting the value and the effectiveness of actually blocking concentrated periods of time and really open people's eyes up to that. So yeah, I'd highly recommend that people do read Deep Work. I think it's a classic, but Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. It's been around for so long. Many people have probably already read it. It's quite a long read, but it does provide a really helpful heuristic. Again, a kind of a thinking tool, a rule of thumb, to look at this dual process way of thinking. So this idea of system 1 and system 2, and generating this awareness of how very often we fall into this reactive mode of thinking rather than the slower deliberative mode. And the way that I think that applies in terms of productivity is recognizing that very often this constant stimulation in the knowledge work environment leads us to predominantly be operating on system 1 rather than taking a step back and being reflective and thinking about, for example, how we structure our day in a more considered approach rather than just kind of constantly switching from one thing to another. They'd be my 2 big recommendations, really. One of the things I'm really looking forward to doing after my PhD is just getting back and just reading a few more kind of books. There's so much great material out there. You look at my bookshelf behind me, and some of those have been read, some of those haven't. But It's no coincidence that the fundamentals of data science and visualization are right there front and center, which probably gives you a bit of a sense of some of the stuff I've been digging into over the past few months.
Oh dear, you need to be in the high gear for that. Yeah. James, I'll of course link to your website and your social media, including your LinkedIn. But is there anything else that you'd like to plug? I know that you've got your Sustainable Performance Academy.
Yeah, so thanks for that opportunity, Greg. So I synthesized a lot of the stuff, some of the things we talked about, these principles, into a course that you can get online called the Sustainable Performance Academy. And we look at all things like working smarter, sleep, daytime recovery, physical exercise, nutrition, breathing exercises, for example, and how those can help support sustainable performance. And you recorded them as these short 5-minute videos in France when I was in the Alps, talking and riding my bike and doing all kinds of things like that, as well as some of the science that underpins it and making it very practical. And thousands of people have done that course now and have had some really positive benefits in terms of reducing their experience of stress, improving their sleep, for example, both B2C and B2B. So if you're interested, I encourage you to check that out. It's available B2C at sustainableperformanceacademy.com. It's also available to license if you're a business who's interested in providing that to your employees. But otherwise, just be great if I'm very active on LinkedIn. Connect with me there. I share a lot of content for free. Always really interested to hear people's feedback and perspectives on it. And would welcome the opportunity to continue this conversation and for people to pick up on some of the things we've discussed and hear people's views on it.
It's very high quality content, and I always enjoy your videos too, James. It's like an exercise in you trying to maximize the cognitive load of you conveying the information by concurrently cycling or cutting vegetables or making coffee. But I just want to end by saying thank you so much for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And hopefully the conversation between the two of us will continue, because I think in many ways we think very similarly about things, and it's been really fun speaking with you today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again for the opportunity, Greg, and likewise look forward to continuing the conversation.